Hello and welcome to the Godless Family Webcast. I'm your host, Aubrey Adrianson, and with me tonight is my co-host, Amanda Hayes. Say hello, Amanda.
Hi.
And with us tonight is Dr. Dave Hawks. And say hello, Dr. Dave Hawks.
Hi, everyone from Australia.
Right, and we've had Dave on before, and like he said, he's from Australia. And tonight he's going to talk to us about homeopathy. And so we are just going to jump right into our questions. And Dave, why don't you start by telling us what homeopathy is?
Sure. So a lot of people think homeopathy is the same as naturopathy or natural medicine. So the idea that you can use plants or herbs to treat medical illnesses. The problem is it's not really. So homeopathy is the idea that the symptoms of the disease can be treated by something that caused the symptoms. So it was first proposed in the late 1700s and it was officially proposed in 1805, I think it was. So before modern medicine, a long time before modern medicine. So for instance, if you had watery eyes, a homeopathic treatment for that would be, say, onion juice, because onions cause watery eyes. So that's the first premise. It's the laws of similar. It's their law, not a scientific law. And their other one is their laws of infinitesimals. So giving someone onion juice to cure onion eyes, or to cure watery eyes, it's not too bad. But some of these homeopathic treatments are quite toxic, so mercury or something like that. So Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, who came up with homeopathy, came up with the idea that you can actually dilute things. And you dilute them, the water retains the memory of that substance, and once it remembers it, more dilutions make it more powerful. So immediately, the similars people go, it's like vaccination. It's in theory possibly, but not really. But the laws of infinitesimal is what make homeopathy nothing more than water. And I brought along a prop to give you an idea of the dilution. So this is a 50 ml, which is just under 2 liquid ounces in American, tube full of salt. So it's sodium chloride. Very simple, one of the smallest molecules we have. So just 2 atoms. Now this weighs 61.3 grams. I'm not going to try and convert that. And it has 6.31 by 10 to the 23 molecules. So molecules of salt. So it's not grains of salt, it's molecules, which is that many molecules of salt. So the problem is a standard homeopathic dilution is something called 30C. So that's a C is you take 1 drop of water and dilute it in 99 drops. So 1 in 100, and then that's 1C, so 1 in 100. So a standard is 30C. 30C would be diluted roughly 10 with 37 zeros after it. Once you get to 1 molecule in this tube, then you dilute it 10 followed by 37 zeros more, and that's a standard solution. So there's obviously no molecules left. I think that makes sense. So to find a single molecule of a standard homeopathic solution, so a liquid, you'd need all the oceans in the world by about 1,000 to find 1 molecule. Not 1 grain of salt, but 1 actual molecule. And the bigger the molecule, obviously, the more dilute it is. So that's what homeopathy is. Some people think that it works, and it does. Homeopathy works. It's not what you were expecting me to say, I assume. But the catch is it works as good as a placebo. So if you have, say, the flu, and you take a homeopathic remedy, you don't take something when you're starting to get the flu. When you get really sick with the flu, that's when you take something, and we're all the same. The problem is, as you get sicker, that's the sickest you get, and then you start to get better. So whether you get homeopathy here, you'll get better. If you don't get homeopathy, you'll still get better. So that's the problem. It appears to work, and it's something called regression to the mean. So with flu, it's self-limiting, or the cold, it goes on for a week or 2 weeks, and then it goes away. So if you take homeopathy a week into a 2-week disease, it will still take you a week to get better, and that's just what it is. But the problem you can get with homeopathy is when people use homeopathy instead of seeking medical advice. And in Australia, we've had a couple of children, so babies die because their parents have given them homeopathy rather than medical treatment. So recently, 2 people in Queensland, which is our equivalent of Alabama, had ended up in prison because their child had eczema, and they only treated it with homeopathy. So eczema, generally not considered life-threatening. The eczema got so bad the child's skin was splitting, the immune system was being overwhelmed, and the child died. There was another case here in Melbourne, in my hometown, where a baby was having fits, and they were seeing a neurologist, and the neurologist was trying to give them medication. They refused it. They only wanted homeopathy, and again, the child died. So that's what homeopathy is. That's sort of the theory behind it. I can go into the exact evidence, but I'll sort of leave that for the moment.
I have a question for you real fast, if you don't mind. Can I cut you off for a sec?
I'm pretty much done. Yeah.
When you say fits, you're talking about seizures?
Yes.
Okay.
So
I have a question too that's even more basic than that. I'm sorry to cut you off. But I'm not sure I understand the actual basics of the logic behind diluting something to make it more effective.
My opinion on this is that homeopathy came around in the 1800s, so it was in a time when medicine was still thinking that bleeding was a really good idea. So medicine was not very effective. So the idea that giving someone, you give them onion juice, it's not going to be too bad. But if you give them, say, well, one of the homeopathic remedies is, and I can probably swear it's on the internet, dog shit. So Canis fecus, I think, is the technical name for it in homeopathy.
Wow.
So obviously you don't want to be eating that. No. But if you dilute it to the point where there's no more molecules left in it, then it's going to be safe. So if you have people who are sick in the 1830s and your options are drill a hole in their skull, bleed them, give them leeches, something else, or give them fresh, clean water or sugar, the fresh, clean water or sugar is going to be much better. And so that's probably why it got a bit of a grip. But the idea is also the dilution. I think it's just a pragmatic thing. You can only come up with a certain amount of treatments that are going to be fine, completely concentrated. So, onion juice, or it could be, alcohol or whatever it is. But you can dilute it more and more and more. It makes pretty much everything safe. There's some great homeopathic remedies which I would really struggle to get in their natural form, like X-rays. So X-rays is a homeopathic remedy, which is funny because it wasn't discovered till well over 100 years after homeopathy came around. Rays of Jupiter. You can buy rays of Jupiter in a homeopathic tablet. I'm not sure how they do that, but that's sort of just some of them. So yeah, so the dilution I think is a pragmatic thing, and the whole memory, water has memory and it gets potentized, because I forgot to mention, to actually make these dilutions, you don't just take one drop and put it in 100. That doesn't do anything. Homeopaths say that does nothing. What you need to do is then bang it, preferably 10 times, and according to strict homeopathic rules, 10 times on the leather Bible. That's the official way of what you do. They don't, when you mass market them, they do a little bit differently, but your hardcore homeopaths will say it has to be on a leather Bible to get the right sort of shaking.
What?
I didn't think it could get weirder.
Yeah, that's crazy, because they're kind of incorporating something else that I didn't think that they would even incorporate into that. I thought they were very distinctly separate.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily religious. I just think in that age, a big weighty metal Bible was it was a good solid surface to bang it against too, and the leather gave it a bit of sort of, and so it's not so much the Bible or the Word of God. It's just that that's the correct sort of density and force of which you can hit something, and so they just, rather than working out, what you can do, they use a leather Bible. In professional sort of big companies, and in Europe, the leading manufacturer of homeopathy made, I think they had an income of $750 million last time I checked, per annum. So this is not people running out of their backyard. That's $750 million with a B. And what they do is they just get a tube and they shake it, then they empty it out, and then put more water in, and then they shake it. So it's, again, pragmatism plays quite a large role in why things are done in homeopathy.
Wow.
But you know that all homeopathic solutions are approved by the FDA in the US?
Oh, wow.
I am having a hard time hearing you guys. You do hear each other okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. It's probably just me.
So, yeah.
So why do people think well, you already covered this, and I just wanted to ask it just in case there's anything you wanted to add. But why do people think that homeopathy works?
I think one of the reasons is that a lot of people are into sort of natural medicine, and homeopathy, as opposed to traditional Chinese medicine or herbs, is just water or sugar when it's 30 seed dilution. So it's actually very safe. If you give someone a Chinese herb, by definition, it's got chemicals in it. It could have contaminants, everything like that. Whereas homeopathy that you buy off the shelf or from someone is generally just pure water. You're not going to do too much damage by giving someone pure water. And I know a friend of mine, their parent has like 35 homeopathic tablets a day. And unless she comes down with type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes, it's probably not going to do her too much damage. So it's safe. So you can experiment, you can feel as good and in control about your health as you want to. And you can take 60 different remedies and they're not going to, it's not like taking 3 different medications where the chance of them interacting badly is, increasing the more you want. So it gives people the feeling that they've got control over their health, and unless they don't see a doctor about serious things, it's pretty low risk. So I think those sort of things combine as to why people use homeopathy. And yeah, I mean, homeopathic vaccinations are also a thing. So people think that they can use homeopathy to vaccinate, and that's one where it actually gets pretty dangerous.
Mm-hmm. So can you speak to that then, the dangers of homeopathy?
Sure. So it's called homeoprophylaxis, and Melbourne, my hometown, has the dubious honour of the only PhD in homeopathy from a very good university that I know of is from Swinburne, which is just down the road from where I am. And they gave it to a guy who was working on homeoprophylaxis, and he claimed that homeopathy prevents disease, like a vaccination, and he's still going 25 years later, and I've had a few head-to-heads with him, both in public and in the internet. But the problem is it's really poorly controlled. In his own thesis, he had to say that there was no statistically significant difference between the homeopathy and the placebo. And that's because there's no difference between the homeopathy and the placebo. It's still sugar pills. But in itself, whatever. If you give someone a homeopathic vaccination against a disease we don't have vaccinations for, yeah, it's not going to do too much risk because, there's no better practice. Whereas if you give someone a homeo, and in certain areas in Australia, and I think sort of, I'm guessing Northern California and Oregon and even Seattle would be these sorts of areas in the States, there's this, we don't want to get vaccines, but we can have homeopathy as a vaccine substitute, which works just as well. But when people have homeopathy, they're not having the vaccine. So you can have all the homeopathy for measles you want, but you can still get measles. And if you're still getting measles, then you've still got a 1 in 500 chance of having encephalitis and all these other things. So that's the issue with homeopathy in terms of vaccination. And yeah, it comes up occasionally on the web.
That's kind of concerning because I didn't realize that there were homeopathic vaccinations. I live in Seattle, and so there are quite a few parents that I've run into who are very much against vaccinating, or have said, well, we're on an alternative vaccination schedule. But I've never heard anybody say anything about homeopathic vaccinations. I didn't even realize they exist.
Yeah, they're one of the things which even in homeopathy is quite fraught. So the British Homeopathic Association, which is one of the biggest in the world, has a very clear statement that homeoprophylaxis, so homeopathic vaccinations, do not work. So when the Homeopathic Society is saying they don't work, it gives you an idea of this is sort of a fringe of a fringe. Mm-hmm. So, but it is, when people say they're on alternative vaccination schedules and stuff like that, ask them, because some people think, honestly, that their homeopathic is equal to another vaccination. And so people really believe that it's exactly the same thing but safer and natural and low risk. And it is low risk for taking it, but it's high risk for actually getting the disease.
Yeah, we actually have had several measles outbreaks just in our area alone over the past year, and it's really frightening.
Yeah, I think I've told you before, I've got a 10-month-old son now, and when he was 6 weeks old, we just visited with my parents, and then I got a call. My father had whooping cough, and he had whooping cough when my son had it. So it was, I think, within a day of the youngest they would allow you, so he went and had the vaccination. But we've had a number of deaths, and I've spoken to the parents with whooping cough, and so it's certainly something I'm pretty passionate about, and as a parent, it's one of those things my wife just says, you know too much, and that makes me a bad parent in terms of, like, I do worry about everything. She worries about him falling down and breaking his arm. I'm kind of like, yeah, that's fine, arm's healed. I worry about infectious diseases, so it's a bit of a balance there, and I do try not to pull the trigger on my anxiety too often. But yeah, it's worrying when you see that, some of the outbreaks. I think there was deaths of people in the UK due to measles last year, I think it was, or earlier this year, and yeah. But with homeopathy, it's how people feel like they take control of their health, and then it's also some things medicine can't fix. There is no golden bullet to a lot of conditions, and homeopathy will try and sell you that golden bullet. Because the other thing is, it's really, really expensive. So if you buy a sugar pill, a homeopathic sugar pill, it works out at, the sugar pill will cost you about $2,100 per kilo. That's how much your homeopathy is costing you. If you would buy that as sugar, it would cost you about $1.60. If you were actually to buy the sugar pills that they use to put the homeopathic mixture onto, it would cost you about $12.
Oh my God.
So it's incredibly expensive, because it's just these sugar pills with a drop of the water containing the magic. But if you actually look at it as a purely financial thing, and a lot of homeopaths make their own solutions, because unlike doctors in Australia, I'm pretty sure it's the same in the US, is doctors in Australia can't make their own drugs, and they can't sell their own drugs. They have to write a prescription, it goes to the pharmacist. The idea being that the doctor can't profit from recommending something to their patients. And there's a lot of laws about what doctors can and can't do, and pharmaceutical companies break the law and they get fined, and that's what it is. But with homeopathy and alternative medicine, there is no regulation. So a homeopath can say, oh, you should be on 5 different medications, and they'll happily sell you those medications at what's obviously a massive markup. And so they can actually profit from it. But part of the placebo with homeopathy is that, have either of you had a homeopathic consultation?
No. I remember when my daughter was teething, a friend of mine was trying to get me to do the homeopathic teething tablets, and she ended up buying some because she was babysitting my daughter, and she swore up and down that they worked, and I'm telling you, she was fine. And so then I'm like, all right, well, if they work and she's sleeping better, all right, I'll buy some. And it was whatever. Work.
They didn't work, you said?
No.
No?
For any of the parents at home, you can actually do that experiment. You can do it very safely. So the homeopathic teething tablets are one of the most popular, and new parents, I know, we are suckers. And we're likely to, it's one of the periods that they really can sell you on a lot of alternative medicines. From the amber teething necklaces are a really big thing in Australia, and then homeopathic teething tablets. What you do is, if you're the main carer, say probably the mum, get your husband or partner or whatever to give the child or don't give the child these tablets. Each, 3 days of the week, give them to them, 4 days don't, and don't tell you. And at the end of the week, you make the call on what days you think that the child was behaving better. And that's just a really simple, single-blind experiment, and you'll have no idea whether or not you'll make the call, and you'll go, yes, they had it on this day, this day, and this day. And the chances are 50%. So you should probably get one. If you do it for 4 days, they get the tablets. 3 days, they don't. Probably you get maybe two of the days correct, which is chance. Unless you get all 4 days out of 7, then you can sort of see for yourself that it's not really working. So that's a really simple experiment. If you are concerned, if it's something you're interested in, don't take my word for it. You can do that yourselves, and it's low risk, and it won't cost you too much money. And if you've got them already, it won't cost you anything. Just get your partner to give them, or not give them, the child the tablet, particularly when they're not talking. If they can tell you that they've had the tablet, probably doesn't work.
Yeah. And, and I thought it was weird, too, because she didn't complain a lot when she was teething, so I didn't even why this friend of mine thought it was even necessary to give her the tablets in the first place, because she wasn't, she was cranky, because I think her molars were coming in at that time, but, she would eat, she would sleep. It wasn't a big deal to me.
Yeah, people want the best. People want their children to be free of pain. People want everything to be the best. So I don't criticize the people who are saying this will work, because they really just want the best for you. They're not, particularly if they're buying them and giving to them, then they're not making any money off it. They're just trying to be good people, and I really support it. I think these people have, with most alternative medicines or any advice they give it to you because they want the best for you. Mm-hmm. It's the people that are selling it, and some of them are true believers, but people are selling it and they're making money from that belief, and that's the issue I have. I have no problem with homeopathy being available. I think it just should have a sticker that says there is no evidence that this works. And if you choose to do that, fantastic, go nuts. I believe it's an open marketplace, and if you want to do that, great. It's like people are microwaving their iPhones because they saw a thing on the internet that you can charge them that way. And I think that's sort of technological natural selection.
Oh my God.
It's a big thing. We've had warning, like I saw it on the web a couple of days ago, and in our papers today in Australia, we've had these warnings. Don't microwave your phones because the new OS 8 doesn't give you the ability to charge them within 60 seconds in your phone in the microwave. But yeah.
Wow.
Just on a side issue for that. But
oh, I did not even know that. I feel, yeah, natural selection is right. I feel like common sense would tell you not to flip and do that.
But that's also a thing. It's like common sense in medicine doesn't work. That's the other thing people think. Is like, you think about homeopathy, you're thinking about, well, that's not very logical. But a lot of things in medicine, a lot of things about biology don't make sense. They work because they've been selected for hundreds, thousands of years, millions of years. And it doesn't mean that they're the most logical way of doing it, but it's like we're born with, 100 billion neurons, 186 billion neurons. By the time we're 18, half of them have died. That doesn't seem very logical. That seems like a lot of waste going into developing all these neurons and then killing half of them off by the time we actually get old enough to understand them. But there's a whole reason of biological processes for why this happens. And it's not logical. I mean, you look at the way our bodies are designed, well, not designed, the way our bodies have developed, and they're absolutely not very logical. Like, we've got a nice, very heavy part of our body, the most armoured part of our body is the skull, protecting our brain. Incredibly important. And it's held up by our spine, which is like that big at the back, and then some just loose tissue. And so you've got this very thin, poorly constructed thing between the brain and the heart needs to pump, all the blood to the brain. It's not designed, it's not common sense, it's not at all logical, but there's a whole variety of factors that have gone into why that is. And there's a whole thing with medications, and they don't seem very logical. When you understand all the in-depth details, then it makes sense. But it's certainly not logical, and it's certainly not common sense. And that's where these alternative therapies aren't any different. They don't make sense, but the difference is there's evidence that the medicines or the treatments work, whereas there's no evidence. And so if that makes sense, it's one of the things that why people don't often take bad health advice, whether they wouldn't take bad engineering advice. Because engineering is quite logical. you kind of go, well, you wouldn't try and run your car on blueberry juice. You wouldn't, because it's kind of going, well,
blueberry juice is expensive.
But you kind of go, well, blueberry juice doesn't catch fire. I don't know much about cars, but I know there's a spark plug and the spark ignites the fuel. Blueberry juice, not flammable. Someone says, could you run a car on tequila? You go, ooh, maybe. And now we have fuels that are 95% ethanol, so well, technically you can. And that's really logical, and engineering is logical. Biology is not logical because it's been selected for different reasons in different environments, and yeah, it's so hard to understand unless you know the specific details. Like I do virology, neuroscience, and physiology. Once you start getting me into sort of animals, native animals, it all falls apart for me because I did a bit in, like I have a minor in ecology, Australian ecology, but getting into some of the details, if I don't know the specific categories and understand the specific cases, I can't sort of go, oh, well, this is probably what happens because it's just a guess. Mm-hmm. And that's why there's no laws of biology. There's laws of physics, there's laws of chemistry, but there's no laws of biology because we don't understand enough to actually understand why something works.
So how do we know
I think I'm taking you off track.
No, it's okay. I think this goes right well into the next question, which is how do we know medicine works?
Okay, so medicine, the gold standard, the thing that everyone talks about is clinical trials. Now, as a student, I was broke, as most students are, and I was also curious, so I actually put myself in for a clinical trial. So it was for a drug that had never been tested in humans before. So they rigged me up and they had an IV line in one arm and an IV line in the other arm, and I was in there for, I think, 5 days, and they controlled my food and drink, and then they put the drug in one arm, and then they took blood out the other arm at like 5, 15, 24, 40, however many times they are, and looked at how our bodies metabolized it. So that's like the first stage. They check first stage clinical trials check whether it's safe. And they always use boys because we're expendable. But it's also because we produce a lot of sperm, and so if we damage our sperm with the drug, then we can just make $100 billion more the next day. Women don't have that luxury. So first stage clinical trials are nearly always in men, unless it's something, like a cervical cancer vaccine. Probably not going to trial that well in men, but they still would have given it the first time in men just for the safety. Then you go into second and third stage clinical trials, and essentially what a clinical trial is, like the gold standard is a double-blind, randomized clinical control trial. Double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized. So what that means, all the words are double-blind. It means that the person getting the drug and the person giving the drug, the doctors don't know whether they've got the drug or the placebo. So that's double-blind. It's fairly straightforward. Randomized means randomized. Now, that doesn't mean you get 100 people and you go, the 50 on the left get the drug and 50 on the right get the placebo. What it means is I'm a 37-year-old Anglo-Saxon male, haven't smoked in 10 years, BMI, body weight of sort of the upper end of normal. They will try and find a 37-year-old Anglo-Saxon, hasn't smoked in 10 years, matches perfectly. Their ideal would be my twin brother who I've lived with my entire life, and then split them up. So randomized is actually so that you've got the exact same amount of end characteristics in both the placebo and the control group. So they'll split you up, then they won't know which gets the drug or not. And this is really important because there's actually a case in the I do a lot of stuff with HPV vaccine, and this gets thrown up about every 4 months. They found that the vaccine can actually cause cervical cancer. Have you guys heard that?
No.
I don't think so.
Yeah, it comes around, and what it is was there was a small subset of one of the clinical trials that found that, yeah, the women who got the vaccine did have a high rate of cancer. I think it was 100 or 200 women in total, and they were really worried about this. And so they looked at it, and they found that there was a massive skew between the women who got the vaccine had a much higher, like really high level of smoking, whereas the women in that trial had a really low level of smoking who got the placebo. So then they kept all of those women in the trial and they added more so that they had the same amount of smokers on both sides. And once they did that, then there was actually no statistical difference. But they hadn't randomized properly for that sort of sub-trial, and so they got an effect, and that was obviously very worrying for them, so they expanded it, and so that's why we randomize. Placebo-controlled, your placebo is not water. Your placebo is the exact same thing without your drug. So in a vaccine, it will be all the constituents of your vaccine, but without the actual antigens. With the pharmacology, it's all the packers, all the tablets, all the capsules, except the actual active drug, and they'll put something that's normally quite related to it in it. And then what they do is they give them to people, and then they monitor them, and they look at the side effects, and then they look at whether the side effects are different between the two groups. The problem is, well, it's not a problem, it's actually a good thing, that if you give someone a drug and they report a headache, you have to list that as a possible side effect. If you give someone a glass of water, if you give 1,000 people a glass of water at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, someone will report a headache later that day. It's just the law of numbers. Like all the stuff that everyone has probably once a week. You know, you'll have a headache, a bit of muscle soreness, maybe a bit of back soreness, dry mouth, maybe a blocked nose. A lot of these things come up when you look at the list of possible side effects. It's because someone in the drug trial came up with that effect. Now, it doesn't mean it's caused by it, but it just means, well, it could be. Generally, the minor things, they just go, yeah, chuck everything in. If it's sort of like, you know, comes up with bleeding from the eyes, they're going to look into that. Bleeding from the eyes falls into the serious side of things. Random headache that clears up in an hour, they have to put it down, but it doesn't mean that the drugs caused it. It just means that someone's had that. And so that's why you get all those side effects. You know, you look up anything, you're going to, a glass of water, it's like, could cause headache. Doesn't make sense until you understand. So with clinical trials, that's how we know that something works. Now, clinical trials are great. You can do them with tens of thousands of people, but when you put something out into the community, America's got 300 million people? About that?
I've never looked.
Oh, man.
So if you do a clinical trial with 100,000 people, that's a pretty big clinical trial. But if something happens 1 in a million, you won't necessarily pick it up. So when a drug is actually released into the US or Australia or anywhere in the world, they have something called post-marketing surveillance, which means that they keep a track. Anyone who says, I took a pill and I got a headache, can write it on a little form electronically and it gets submitted. And this is how they've actually picked up problems with vaccines and problems with other drugs some of them were quite rare, like 1 in a million, 1 in 2 million, and so they can pick them up once it's in the community. Anything that's 1 in 100,000, they should pick up in a clinical trial. So I think that's clinical trials, and then there's this continued level of investigation. And that's how we know medicine works, because we're biased. As a scientist, 10% of my job is coming up with the experiments and doing them. 90% of my job is trying to make sure that I don't introduce my own biases, because I have a view of what, based on the literature, and what will happen. And my PhD, one of the things that all the literature says, this particular thing happened with HIV in the cell, and I went, okay, that's no worries, we'll finish that stuff off and then we'll get our answer. And we got a really unusual result. So I spent 2 years coming up with all the controls, and we finally understood that the literature were actually wrong, and the reason was the way the experiment was carried out didn't have the appropriate controls. And so that's what science is. It's just all, like, to get a Nature paper, the top journal. I have a friend who got one. He said 3 months to do the experiments, 2 years to do the controls.
Wow.
And that's how science and medicine works, and that's what a clinical trials, and that's how we know, because scientists don't try and find things. Scientists try and disprove things. So if you can disprove gravity, you'll get 2 Nobel Prizes and $1 million a year for life. If you can disprove any of those things, I mean, in Australia, a guy got a Nobel Prize because we used to think stomach ulcers were caused by stress. A guy called Barry Marshall from Perth found that they were caused by bacteria. And people laughed at him, he got a lot of grief, but after 10 years, people accepted it. It's now norm. He's got a Nobel Prize, he's very wealthy, and he gets to spend his life talking about his favourite topic, which is Barry Marshall. So yeah, if you're a scientist and you can prove something that we think is true wrong, it's the fastest way to fame, academic brilliance, everything. So we're actually trying to knock everything. We're the ultimate critics.
So you've touched on this already, but you talked about how we know medicines work, and then how I think you already answered this, how we know they are safe, because the clinical trials.
Yeah, so clinical trials and also post-marketing surveillance for rare effects.
Mm-hmm. And so, what's it going to take for scientists to start believing that homeopathy works?
Very, very simple. If you can come up with, now, I don't care what remedy or what condition, doesn't bother me. It's got to be, all you need to do is have a condition that is not self-limiting. So it's not the flu. If you have, say, people with terminal cancers are good for this trial, bad for anyone who's got it. But if you have terminal cancer that kills 95% of people, or gets to a certain stage, or will kill 100% of people, and you give them homeopathy versus a placebo, excuse me, and the people who get homeopathy are cured, I will believe it. Very simple. There's nothing else. Tim Minchin, an Australian comedian, does a great thing on it, and he says, you know, if you can prove that homeopathy works and how it works, I will fancy that with I think it's a compass on the side of my cock. I'll scratch it in. He goes, I'll be embarrassed as hell, and we'll have to bin physics. We'll have to redo the laws of physics and chemistry. But if it works, it works. And I guess there's a sort of subtle difference there, is that there's two things, evidence-based medicine and science-based medicine, and they often get interchanged, but what evidence-based medicine is, and this is all I need for homeopathy, is that if you can show it works, so if you can sort of give it to people blinded, placebo, randomized, and show that the homeopathy actually cures it or treats it in a way that the placebo doesn't, that's evidence-based medicine. I'm fine with that. Science-based medicine is the same thing, but understanding how. So a lot of the time, we don't actually know how anesthesia works. The exact mechanism's not quite clear. But we know it works, and if anyone's ever had surgery, you can attest that it works. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's not a placebo effect. But that's evidence-based medicine. We know that it works, we can use it, we can calculate it, it's fine. But we don't necessarily understand it. So it's not science-based medicine per se. So with homeopathy, we just need to show that it works and it's reproducible. So it can't just be one person going, we did this trial, because, you know, people are dodgy. But if it was reproduced in labs or in hospitals around the world by different people, particularly people who are, you know, cynics, were able to reproduce their results in their own lab, we'd accept it without a problem. Mm-hmm. It would be great. It would be cheap. It would be easy. It would, you know, you don't have to develop most of them. You just seem to leave some tablets out in the sun and you get magic. So it would be great.
I had a question and then I lost it. So maybe Amanda has something to fill in while I think about it again.
Oh, well, mine, I was going to kind of save it for a little bit later because it's going off track a little bit. But just to give you some time to think, I'm going to pepper this in there. What is the difference between homeopathy and osteopathy? Have you heard of that?
Oh, yeah. Osteopathy is chiropractic and osteopathy are actually fairly close. The difference is chiropractic works on the theory that all problems can be cured by straightening the spine. Obviously, if it's a sporting injury, yeah, probably. If it's an infectious disease, it can't. And I wrote a paper for the Medical Journal of Australia earlier this year about chiropractic, so I have some past form with it, but that's what chiropractic is, and we can talk about that another day. Osteopathy incorporates some of the techniques of chiropractic, but basically is musculoskeletal. So it's a bit like physiotherapy. So you've got sort of chiropractic at the sort of less evidence-based end. You've got physiotherapist at the at the evidence-based, and osteopathy is probably closer to physiotherapy. So homeopathy and naturopathy are probably the two sort of closest things you could compare, and naturopathy is obviously natural. So the theory behind what works is a bit different, but they don't also have the dilution thing. But generally, most naturopaths will also practice some homeopathy. So they can't even get themselves straight. The idea of trying naturopathy is the herbs will cure your disease, and homeopathy is that you need to dilute them to make them powerful, but they go side by side, and it's sort of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Like in traditional Chinese medicine also argues against this stuff, but people often use them as a combination in the same therapist, and it makes no sense to me because they're not complementary. They're actually against each other in their actual worldview.
Yeah, I know, like I said, a couple people that are mostly they're into the natural medicine, so taking herbs and making teas and things like that. But every once in a while, they'll talk to me about some homeopathic remedy that they have. And I remember having a conversation with one woman, and I forget what it was we were talking about, but she recommended that I take something, and her justification for me taking that over whatever medication that I was considering was that it didn't have any chemicals. And it really cracked me up because, like, of course plant material has chemicals in it. If it works at all, there's going to be some kind of chemical in it. And then, of course, if you wanted to go down, all the way down to chemistry, everything has chemicals in it. And so it just kind of cracked me up how she didn't even know what's in these plants that she's recommending that I take. That there's chemicals in those plants, and if they work at all, that's what's going to be helping me. And so it's really frustrating talking to homeopaths and naturopaths because I don't even think they have just a basic understanding of chemistry.
Yeah, I mean the problem is I don't know what it's like in the US, but in Australia that there's some arguments at the moment. But essentially, you can become a homeopath in about a year of some really dodgy training. There's no real degree with it. It doesn't require any knowledge of physics, and you can just. That's it. But yeah, they talk about no chemicals. The other one they talk about is sort of like a synthetic. Say a synthetic folic acid isn't as good as the natural folic acid. It's like, no, it's folic acid. It's identical. Whether synthetic is just how it's produced. So whether you produce, synthetic folic acid or vitamins, and people say they're bioidentical. It's like, yeah, because it's vitamin A. Vitamin A is bioidentical to vitamin A because it's vitamin A. It doesn't matter whether it's from fish oil. It doesn't matter whether it's from anything. It's still, vitamin A is a specific chemical structure, and that's what it's called. It's like salt is NaCl. My favorite thing at the moment is there's a lot of places promoting organic salt, which as a chemist, organic chemistry involves carbon change, and there's no carbon, so that doesn't make sense. And in terms of how do you have non-organic salt? Like, you could technically produce it, but the amount of energy required to make salt would be incredible, whereas you can go to the sea and get a bucket of water and leave it out in your backyard in a sunny day for a couple of days, and you'll have as much salt as you can possibly want. And yeah, it's a really weird. It's with those. I guess one of the things I often use is people say, "Oh, I'll take homeopathy, but I'll see a doctor for something else," and I go, "Okay, so would you take homeopathy if you were told you had cancer?" No. Okay, so that's your upper limit. Would you take homeopathy for a headache? Yes. Okay, so where do we meet in the middle? And if you actually try and nut them down, you go, okay, so an inflamed liver, is that a homeopathy or a medicine? And if you actually try and nut them down, it actually reveals something to themselves that they're kind of going, okay, where do you draw the line, and why do you decide to draw this line that it's a medicine problem versus a homeopathy problem? And you'll kind of go, most people, you go, well, that's a self-limiting illness. That's where it comes down to. It's like, you want to take a tablet to make yourself feel better, but you know that your headache will go away on its own. My favourite is with the amber necklaces. My wife is quite supportive, but gets a bit tired of me ranting about this stuff, but she came up with the best answer I've ever heard to these sort of, what the amber necklaces are?
No.
There's an amber necklace, preferably from Gdansk in Poland, and there's meant to help with teething. Now, there's two ways they suggest. Number one, it's the aura from the natural amber. And number two is by sucking on it, you can release some sort of magic acid that works as an analgesic and gives the child sort of pain relief. So let's just leave the aura stuff, but they found that, number one, the temperatures in a baby's mouth won't get the crystals anywhere near hot enough to release this. Number two, this chemical doesn't actually have any analgesic effects anyway. It has no pain relief effects. So fails on both of those things, but it's a necklace around a baby, so there's a massive choking hazard with that. And the other thing is, amber's quite brittle, and so if they're slamming down it, they can actually cause fragments which can get lodged in their throat. And my wife, someone in her mother's group was talking about it, and she said, would you cure your own diseases with crystals? And she's got a cousin who does, who really believes in crystals. And for her, using the amber necklace, I'm going, that's at least consistent. Like, she's used crystals for 25 years. She thinks that they do all this stuff for her. Great, makes sense. Everyone else goes, I will take a paracetamol for my headache, but for my child, I want to give them an amber necklace. It's like, why not just give them the same thing you would take?
Right.
So it's a mentality people have, and when you actually try and draw them out, a lot of people kind of go, yeah, that doesn't make sense, and they won't convert away from it immediately, and they might never, but at least they're making their own discoveries for themselves. And I'm really hesitant of saying, well, homeopathy is bullshit. You should stop taking that, because I truly believe you have the right to take whatever you want, and it's your choice, and you can make that decision as a compass adult. Go crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I understand the allure because, like you were saying, it's just a sugar pill or sugar water, so it is safe. And especially when we're talking about babies, you don't want to be giving your baby medicine. But you know, but at the same time, I want it to work, you know, and then, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I've never fully understood the mindset of even naturopathic parents. They're going to, I don't know, dilute chamomile in water and give it to their baby, and it's going to calm their baby down. And it's just like, you know, holding your baby and rocking it calms it down too. I mean, why you gotta do the chamomile, and then of course, like with chamomile, it's a ragweed, so you know you have an allergy risk there that you've never, you know, taking into consideration. It's just if my child is really not calming down and I need something, well then I think then you would call the doctor. You wouldn't call a homeopath or a naturopath. That to me, that's common sense.
Yeah, I guess there's sort of two things in there. The first is I wrote a tweet a couple of weeks ago saying that as a straight man, I never thought I would need the ability to know how hard to smack a male on the arse to get them to sleep. But it's a skill that I've certainly learned, and I'm very appreciated that I now have. And that's sort of comforting. And the other thing is you sort of went to, I don't want to give the baby medicine, and that's your natural reaction. Imagine Amanda has exactly the same reaction. It's like, I don't want to give them medicine, and you sort of think about it and you go, I'm putting words into Amanda's mouth, obviously, but why? And it's something innate, and we don't really like. I kind of go, I do it myself. I'm going, oh, he's got a bit of a fever. Well, with a fever, it's really straightforward. I have no issue. But when he's kind of going, oh, is he grizzly? Is it this? Oh, I don't really want to give him the medicine. I'm kind of going, but why? His grizzly, a number of other things that normally work haven't. This is obviously not his normal state. Why wouldn't we give some medicine? And if the medicine works, then we go, all right, well, there's something that the medicine is playing on. This is something we have to keep a note of. But my natural instinct is the same. It's like, well, I don't give him medicine. It's like, why?
Mm-hmm.
We know it works. We know that the safety profile of these things in babies is, you know, most of the medications for babies have been around for decades, and there's a safety profile on them very, very detailed. And I mean, even with acetaminophen, we call it paracetamol. the US has lowered the dose to 3 grams a day versus 4 grams a day, whereas in Australia it's still 4 grams a day and it's considered perfectly safe. And so we know this. We know the safety levels on the packet are actually below what the safety levels actually are, but we still pull back from it, and I don't know why. It's probably some psychology in there, but yeah, it's the same thing as, oh, I don't want to give a medicine. And people in homeopathy just sort of take that to another level.
Yeah, I've kind of gotten over it. I have my staples, I have my Motrin, and I have my Benadryl, and those are, I'll even say, those are my miracle drugs. But yeah, but I do save them until I feel like, okay, me and my child, whatever the issue is they're having, we've had enough. It's time for the Motrin, or it's time for the Benadryl, for whatever.
Yeah, working whether it's, it takes a while to work out if this is the normal range, because babies change so often. It's just sort of hard to get, is this within the normal range, and that's sort of a floating target. And then once you get above it, you go, yep, no worries, time to deal with this.
Mm-hmm. Amanda?
I was just wondering what other kinds of medicines you're talking about, because honestly, the only thing I really had in my arsenal for my kids when they were babies was Tylenol. So, and I didn't like dose them every day, but I never really hesitated to give them Tylenol if there was like an actual fever present. But I do know that anytime I went and got them vaccinated, the doctor was very clear to tell me not to give them Tylenol at all if they're fussy or if they get a fever from it. So I didn't, because they said it's very important not to give them any acetaminophen. But I haven't. What other medications? I mean, I know you said Benadryl, but is that for babies or is that just for bigger kids?
Oh, you can give Benadryl to babies. Benadryl's that's one of the reasons why, and Dave can probably better answer this, but it's one of the safest drugs on the market. It's one that I think you'd actually have to try to OD on it. And it's good for if you have sinus congestion, or if you take a sleep aid, like an over-the-counter sleep aid, that's Benadryl.
Yeah.
So I always like to say, not a medical doctor, PhD doctor. So this is just my understanding. So acetaminophen is what we call paracetamol. And Benadryl, I'm not quite sure, but the other one that we use a lot is ibuprofen. So I don't know, do you have Nurofen, or I'm just trying to think of the brand name?
It's ibuprofen.
Yeah, we have ibuprofen.
Yeah, so they're the two drugs that we generally give. Now, the risks with acetaminophen are too high levels or chronic use is bad for the liver. And for ibuprofen, too long use can cause gastrointestinal, so they often like you to have it on a full stomach. So they're the two most things. They've got very good profiles. The funny thing is, in Australia, with some of our vaccines, they actually recommend you have your acetaminophen before the vaccine. Mm-hmm. So there's certain vaccines that have a higher risk of having a fever, and it's just to do with the way the vaccines are made. The fever will go away in a day or so, but they often actually recommend that you have your acetaminophen just before you go to the doctors, and then it will help fight the fever. And because fever in itself for post-vaccine is actually not an issue. It will go away, it's no problem. The problem is there's certain children that have, once they have a fever, they'll have febrile convulsions. So they'll have like seizure due to the fever. Again, very, very scary, but overwhelmingly not an issue. Will go away once you get the fever down. And so that's why they recommend having the paracetamol, the acetaminophen, which reduces fever, prior to the vaccine. They wouldn't do the same thing for ibuprofen. For myself, like my own personal use, I'd take acetaminophen if I had a fever. I'd take ibuprofen if I had muscle aches and pains. And that's how I separate them. But yeah, that's just my personal usage. So yeah, the other thing is it changes and it changes from country to country. It can change from state to state what they recommend, and it changes from vaccine to vaccine. So for anyone who's curious, have a chat to your doctor and do whatever your doctor says, because they're the ones that have the expertise, and they also know what's happening in your microenvironment. So the vaccine that you're using, the people that are around you, all the other things, they'll have an idea of what's happening in their area. So they're the best person for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. Is definitely talk to your doctor, because I would hate for someone to watch the show and be like, well, Aubrey said that you actually have to work really hard to OD on Benadryl, and I give my kid Benadryl, and then we're in the hospital. I would hate for that to happen. So that would definitely always talk to your doctor, especially if your kids can't talk and tell you what's wrong.
There's also really good info sheets available from the CDC and a number of other places. I'll try and keep to US places, and they'll say, okay, so how much, acetaminophen can you have in a day? What's the safe level? What can you give to a child? And if you just search, there's heaps of information from really reputable sources. I like WebMD as well, so WEBMD, and that gives you sort of information about sort of what's the best practice. But it's just a guide, as you said. Always go to your doctor, but those sorts of reputable sources are often really good sort of first step. So if you've given your kid sort of acetaminophen twice in a day, you'll kind of go, the dose is every 4 to 6 hours. Am I pushing it? How many doses can I get in a day? If you're unsure or you feel that the packaging's a bit hard to understand, hit up some of those really reputable sites, and they'll generally give you some off-the-counter, information to give you a bit of a ballpark of where you're at.
Mm-hmm. And don't take homeopathic remedies.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I love wrapping up the show with solid advice for parents.
I was hoping I could actually get a plug in before we go.
You can go for it.
So, as a scientist, one of the things that I do is a lot of community outreach, and I'm really interested in getting people involved in science. And so last year I actually ran a crowdfunding project. So we were trying to raise $10,000 to make these special types of virus I use called viral vectors. And we achieved that. We made nearly $13,000. It was the most successful medical research project in Australia at the time. As of this week, I think it got released late last week, I got interviewed and they wrote an article about it it's a little journal, you might have called it, called The Lancet.
That sounds...
So it's probably... Yeah, so it's probably one of the top 1 or 2 medical journals in the world. So it's not a paper I've written, otherwise I'd still be celebrating. But it was really nice that they've sort of acknowledged that there are scientists, and there's a couple of my friends and colleagues, Dr. Mel Thompson, who's done 2 crowdfunding projects, and her most recent one was called Hips for Hipsters, about doing some research into how to reduce infections after hip transplants. Dr. Martin Rees. And Dr. Martin Rees is up in Sydney, who's doing a sort of an ongoing project with a slightly different format. And so all of us were interviewed, and we got into the Lancet. So I think that we're all quite stoked to be in it's definitely, it's like that and the New England Journal of Medicine are pretty much the top medical journals. So it's freely available if anyone wants to have a look at sort of some of the science I actually do outside of podcasting and tweeting. So yeah,
that's fantastic.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find a link too. I'm sure that the Lancet has a website that we can link to, and maybe.
And it's freely available, so you don't need to log on. There's no sort of, like a lot of journals, you have to have access. This is actually quite easy to get, so I can send that through to you.
Awesome. Yeah.
Excellent.
Well, we're always happy for the good work that you're doing, and we love having you on talking about this kind of stuff. And I think as parents, we want to educate ourselves as much as possible, and then also find out not only what's working for other parents, but what medical science is saying about treatments and options. And so I love having you on so that we can kind of have those discussions.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things it would be great is, like, a lot of people, after I've been on your show, will often tweet me questions, and we might sort of try and hold on one of those and maybe do a question and answer one time again in a month or two. And so if people do have questions about science or medicine, feel free to tweet me, and I'm lobbing you in here, so tweet you guys as well. And maybe we can put up a collection. So if there's anything you're curious about or you don't know, I'm more than happy to look up some evidence for you and come back with some actual numbers and some actual figures so that you can at least go, okay, so that's what it is, and obviously make all the links available, because I always say, don't trust me, don't trust anyone, trust the evidence. So everything I say, I'll give you links to. And so yeah, maybe that's something we can do in a future episode.
No, it sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, I would love to cover other areas of pseudoscience as well.
Okay.
Yeah, that's one of my areas.
Yeah, you told me like what you said about chiropractors. That's something my husband and I have been really interested in as far as not trusting what they're about. So I would love to talk about that more and get some solid evidence on it, because just the preliminary stuff we've seen, we're like, oh, I don't like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we are out of time, and so I just want to wrap this up. And I'm trying to. My computer's really not cooperating with me at this particular moment in time. What did we decide our next episode is about? Again, Amanda, please remind me.
Our place in the animal kingdom.
Our place in the animal kingdom. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So that'll be 2 weeks from yesterday, basically. Oh, crap, I don't have the calendar up. I am sorry, I'm so unprepared.
I think that'd be the 7th.
The 7th, okay.
Yeah, October 7th.
And then we will have Dr. Dave Hawks back on, and I think a Q&A would be great, and so I'm looking forward to that. So hopefully we'll see everyone in 2 weeks, and Dave in a month or so, and have a great night. So bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for having me on.